Hey guys, Grifton here, and today I want to talk about something that has kind of been on the back of my mind, but now that I'm waiting for Phase 2, I thought it'd be a good time to just kind of talk about. So, if you remember the Phase 2, coverage, a message to the WoW community, there was a section in there that talked about the Burning Crusade, but at the end, it kind of teased fresh WoW Classic. So the particular sentence I'm referring to is, we're also working on something for WoW Classic players who've told us they'd like a chance at a fresh start, and we'll be sharing more on our plans soon. Now we haven't heard much from them in about this, so it's a lot of speculation. But there was also a survey that came out, and in it is a lot of interesting questions. So the only three on this survey that I really care about are the more difficult raid bosses and dungeon encounters, increased debuff limit on raid bosses, and no world buffs in raids. The other three are, I want to say, irrelevant. If they're there, that'd be great, but it doesn't really affect class by class. But more difficult raid bosses and dungeon encounters. Now, this is an interesting one for tanks. So, if you're a feral tank in Classic, you may have been able to take a lot less damage than your average Fury Prot that was dual wielding. So, with harder hitting bosses, you might have to think about things like defense gear, or maybe warriors will, or they might have to start wearing a shield, which means that your threat is now looking a lot better, because compared to a shield wielding warrior, a MCP druid is a pretty hard hitter. So that might make druids become the viable go-to tank for a lot of encounters. Some other things to look at is the debuff limit on raid bosses. This could benefit both feral DPS and balance. I don't know the highest DPS rotation for balance in Classic without world buffs, or with world buffs for that matter. But it might be different. Instead of spamming Starfire, you might get to keep your Moonfire and your man, I should know my other debuffs, Insect Swarm up at, while doing regular damage, and that might make you a higher pumper and a more viable candidate for being brought into a raid. Same thing with Feral. Feral pump pretty decently in Classic if they know what they're doing. Imagine being able to add an extra spot for your dots, your bleed effects, to just increase that extra damage. That could be very valuable. I mean, that's essentially how we play currently in TBC. So maybe that's a thing that's going to happen if a fresh WoW comes out and they increase that debuff limit. The third thing is the no world buffs. This is a very interesting concept, because a lot of the numbers we base, our highest CPS and things like that on are world buffed, because everyone does world buffs. Nax, everyone was world buffing. People were world buffing multiple times per raid, if they wiped. And obviously, I know there was a no world buff version of the Warcraft logs that you can check out, but we only did it a couple times, so I can't 100% say this is what I experienced, or this is what the experience is. But I can only tell you what I experienced, and that was Fury Prot dual wielding tanks did not hit very hard. Their threat seemed to struggle immensely without world buffs. Whereas druids with an MCP, they can still pump pretty hard. And I think that's really interesting to think about, because if we go into a no world buff Classic, you might see, again, feral druid tanks being the number one go-to, threat pumper / damage taker, because they can just put on a ton of armor and still be able to put out some decent threat. I definitely think it's going to shake things up. Obviously, you're still going to have, mages be just like these ultimate, farming machines for pretty much everything. You're still going to have, hunters doing their own, their own trash pulls. They can do things like that, which I think will be interesting. But when it comes to these raid mechanics, I definitely think you're going to see druids start coming up in the world. Now, I skipped over Resto, but I do want to hit on it really quick, especially when we're talking about the increased debuff limit. Now, this doesn't say it specifically in there, but if the increased debuff limit also changes the fact that you can have multiple of the same debuff or buff on a target, specifically referring to the HOTS of Rejuve and Regrowth, you could really see more Resto druids in raids. Just because that's one of the biggest limitations, is you can only have one rejuve per target. With having multiple rejuves, it could really mix up main tank healing or just raid healing and things like that. So it's a lot to look forward to if you played Classic and you're like, hey, I played a druid, but I felt like we weren't the most powerful. Well, these changes, these little changes, could really shake up the classic meta. I just wanted to share that with you. I really want to hear your guys' feedback. Maybe you did experience a no world buff guild and you have some better opinions on things like that. But I'd like to hear from you guys what you think. Anyway, this video is kind of just like a fun thing to do while I'm waiting for Phase 2 to drop. But yeah, I'd like to hear you guys. Feel free to subscribe. I put out content all the time. And as always, guys, take care.